In the spring of 1945, when the Third Reich was crumbling beneath a relentless tide of Allied steel, America's P-51 Mustang was the undisputed master of the European sky. It flew escort over Berlin at altitudes where men froze and engines failed. It flew deeper into enemy territory than any single-engine fighter had a right to venture, and it came back. Pilots spoke of it in terms usually reserved for living things, as though the long, tapered fuselage and the Merlin engine's distinctive howl constituted something closer to a soul than a machine. Generals praised it in dispatches. Journalists called it the fighter that won the air war. And for a brief, luminous period, that description was not far from the truth. But the war ended, and when wars end, the machines built to fight them discover a fate the men who designed them never anticipated. What happened next? Almost no one remembers. The North American aviation P-51 Mustang did not begin as an American idea. It began as a British requirement, placed in 1940 with a California manufacturer that had never built a first-line fighter. North American Aviation's engineers drew up the design in 117 days, a figure that would be cited for decades as proof of what urgent necessity can accomplish. The prototype flew in October 1940. Early versions fitted with the Allison engine proved disappointing above medium altitude. Then the British fitted the airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, and the machine became something else entirely. Performance at high altitude transformed from mediocre to astonishing. The marriage of an American airframe to a British engine produced one of the most effective military aircraft ever built. Fast, agile, long-ranged, forgiving enough for young pilots still learning their trade, and lethal enough to take on anything the Luftwaffe could put in the sky. By the time the 8th Air Force began escorting its heavy bombers deep into Germany in late 1943 and early 1944, the Mustang had become indispensable. B-17 and B-24 crews, who had previously flown unescorted into catastrophic losses over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, watched with something close to reverence as the long-nosed fighters appeared out of the cloud cover and took station on their wings. Bomber crews gave them nicknames. They painted their names on the fuselages of the specific aircraft they hoped would be there the next time. The relationship between the heavy bomber and its fighter escort was one of the defining bonds of the air war in Europe, and the Mustang was at the center of it. By the end of the European War, P-51s had destroyed more than 4,950 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. They had flown from England to Poland and back. They had strafed airfields, trains, and convoys from Norway to the Mediterranean. They had, in the assessment of Hermann Göring himself, signaled to him that Germany had lost the air war. When Germany surrendered in May 1945 and Japan followed in August, the United States possessed an air force of staggering size. Tens of thousands of aircraft occupied bases across two hemispheres, supply chains that had been calibrated to deliver replacement parts by the hundreds of thousands now had nowhere to deliver anything. The factories that had produced Mustangs at a rate impossible to conceive in peacetime, North American built more than 15,500 P-51s of all variants, fell silent or retooled for something else. Pilots who had flown combat missions over occupied Europe came home to parades and then to civilian life. The machine they had trusted with their lives was, officially and administratively, surplus property. The word surplus does not convey the magnitude of what followed. The United States government found itself in possession of a military apparatus built for total war and now structurally incompatible with peace. Aircraft by the hundreds were flown to storage depots, their engines preserved against future use, their cockpits sealed. Others were simply left on the airfields where the war had ended, in the Pacific, in North Africa, in Italy, and abandoned to the climate and the curiosity of locals. The machinery of demobilization moved with the same industrial efficiency that had characterized the machinery of mobilization, but in reverse and with considerably less ceremony. For the P-51, the transition from warrior to ward of the government was swift. Aircraft that had been worth their weight in national survival were now assigned a dollar value by the War Assets Administration, and that value was startling in its modesty. Surplus Mustangs were offered at prices that would have seemed farcical even 2 years earlier. The government needed to dispose of them, needed the depots cleared, needed the budget reconciled with a peacetime reality. And so, the fighters that had flown cover over the most dangerous airspace in the world were sold off at prices that reflected nothing of what they had done or what they had cost to build. Some went to flight schools. Some went to agricultural operators who had no particular interest in the fighter's history and a great deal of interest in its payload capacity. Some went to foreign governments, and many, far too many, went to the smelter. The Air Force that emerged from the National Security Act of 1947, the United States Air Force, independent at last from the Army, inherited the Mustang along with everything else. The new service was simultaneously trying to project itself into the jet age and manage the enormous inventory it had been handed. The P-51, redesignated the F-51 under the new Air Force nomenclature, occupied an awkward position. It was a proven combat-tested aircraft, capable of close air support, interdiction, and aerial escort. It was also a propeller-driven machine in a world where the future of military aviation was clearly shaped by the swept wing and the jet engine. The jets were expensive, the jets were temperamental, the jets required longer runways and more sophisticated maintenance infrastructure than many of the overseas bases the Air Force operated could provide. And so, the F-51 survived into the post-war USAF not because anyone particularly wanted it there, but because the alternatives were either unavailable or unaffordable in the required quantities. Air National Guard units received large numbers of F-51s. Reserve squadrons flew them. Overseas commands retained them. The fighter that had been the sword of the 8th Air Force became the workhouse of the peacetime garrison. It was a demotion the machine bore without complaint, as machines do. The pilots who flew the F-51 in the post-war years were not the combat veterans of the European Air War for the most part. They were younger men learning their trade on an aircraft that was already, in the accelerating calculus of the Cold War, considered obsolescent. They learned to respect it anyway. The Mustang demanded respect. It was fast, it was powerful, and it would punish inattention with the same indifference it had always shown. The long torque of the Merlin on takeoff had killed pilots in 1944, and it killed pilots in 1948. The machine had not changed. Only the context had. Korea changed everything. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950, the United States found itself committed to a ground war in a peninsula it had largely demilitarized, with an air force that had been drawing down for 5 years and a frontline jet inventory that was still maturing. The F-80 Shooting Star was the Air Force's primary jet fighter, and it was capable. But it was a thirsty machine with limited range over the Korean terrain, and the bases from which it operated were, in the chaotic opening months of the war, threatened by the speed of the North Korean advance. The F-51 was recalled to combat. It was a decision made by men who understood the irony and accepted it as a military necessity. Pilots who had trained on jets were told to check out in the Mustang. Some of them resented it. Some of them came to respect it with the convert's intensity. The F-51 could operate from shorter, rougher strips than the jets. It could carry bombs and rockets for close air support of ground troops, the grinding, dangerous, low-altitude work that was the dominant requirement of the Korean War's ground campaign. It could loiter over a target longer than the F-80, which was critical when the men on the ground needed fire support and the weather was closing in. The Mustang flew over Korea with the same competent lethality it had displayed over Germany, but in a different mode and against a different kind of threat. It strafed supply columns on the roads south from the Yalu River. It bombed bridges and rail yards and troop concentrations. It flew through anti-aircraft fire that was sometimes intense and often lethal. The aircraft it faced in air-to-air combat were increasingly Soviet-built MiG-15 jet fighters, machines against which the F-51 was fundamentally outclassed in speed, ceiling, and rate of climb. Mustang pilots who encountered MiGs generally had one option: dive away, use the turning radius, survive. Several did not. The F-51 was not designed for a war against swept-wing jets, and Korea exposed that limitation with brutal clarity. The Republic of Korea Air Force flew the F-51 throughout the Korean War, as did Australian squadrons of the British Commonwealth Air Forces. South African pilots flew it. The Mustang served under multiple flags in that conflict, a pattern that reflected the broader post-war dispersal of American military aircraft through the alliance systems and military assistance programs of the early Cold War. By the time the Korean armistice was signed in July 1953, the F-51 was effectively finished as a frontline American combat aircraft. The Air Force was moving decisively to the all-jet inventory. The Mustang's war was over, this time permanently, or so it seemed. But the aircraft's second life had already begun, and it was stranger and more varied than anyone in 1945 could have predicted. The foreign air forces that received P-51s under military assistance programs were not merely preserving the aircraft as a relic. They were using it in earnest, in conflicts that the newspapers of the Western democracies often covered briefly and forgot quickly. The Israeli Air Force flew Mustangs in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, acquiring aircraft through whatever channels were available in a period when official arms embargoes made procurement a matter of improvisation and ingenuity. The Dominican Republic flew them. Nicaragua flew them. Cuba flew them on both sides of the 1959 revolution. Guatemala flew them in the CIA-backed 1954 coup operation. El Salvador and Honduras flew them against each other in the 1969 football war, a conflict whose very name seems to belong to a different register of human experience than the aircraft that fought it. Yet there the Mustangs were, still doing the work of war a quarter century after the armistice in Europe. The P-51's longevity in foreign service was a function of economics and logistics as much as performance. The aircraft was available. It was relatively simple to maintain by the standards of jet-age military aviation. It was armed effectively, and spare parts could be sourced from the enormous pool of surplus American material that flowed through the post-war international arms market. For smaller air forces with limited budgets and limited infrastructure, the Mustang was not an antique. It was a practical tool. The sentiment that would eventually attach to it, the reverence, the nostalgia, the museum-quality preservation, was invisible from the cockpits of air forces that were simply trying to fight wars with what they had. While foreign air forces were still flying the Mustang in earnest over unfamiliar skies, a different fate was quietly assembling itself in the United States. The civilian aviation world had noted the availability of surplus P-51s with the alert eye of people who understood the relationship between performance and price. A Mustang that had cost the government more than $50,000 to build, an enormous sum in the 1940s, could be acquired from government surplus for a fraction of that figure. The aircraft that emerged on the civilian register was modified in ways that prioritized comfort and practicality over combat capability. Guns were removed, fuel systems were reconfigured, cockpit arrangements were sometimes altered to allow a second occupant. The military fighter became in the hands of private owners, something that the engineers at North American had never intended. A personal aircraft of exceptional speed and range. Air racing provided the most dramatic context for the Mustang's civilian afterlife. The national air races at Cleveland, interrupted by the war, resumed in 1946, and the unlimited class, in which any propeller-driven aircraft of any modification could compete, became a showcase for what Mustangs, Corsairs, and Sea Furies could do when stripped of military equipment and pushed beyond their design limits. The Mustang dominated. Pilots who understood the aircraft deeply, who knew how to tune the Merlin for maximum power, how to cool the engine through the demands of a closed-course race, how to extract performance that the Air Force had never asked for, flew modified P-51s to victories that established the type's reputation in a completely different arena. The racing Mustang was not the same aircraft as the escort fighter that had flown over Germany. The modifications accumulated over the decades: clipped canopies, cut-down fuselages, water methanol injection, supercharger modifications, engine combinations that pushed power output far beyond original specification. Some aircraft were so heavily modified that they retained the Mustang's DNA largely in the fuselage structure and the distinctive wing planform. They were, in the terminology of the racing community, Reno Mustangs, a category unto themselves, built to go around a pylon course as fast as physics and metallurgy would permit. The National Championship Air Races at Reno, Nevada, which began in 1964 and ran for decades, became the premier venue for the Mustang's racing legacy. The unlimited class at Reno was a spectacle of extraordinary intensity, aircraft flying at speeds well above 400 miles per hour at altitudes measured in tens of feet above the desert floor, banking hard around the pylons with margins of error that left little room for mechanical failure or human miscalculation. The Mustang was not always the fastest aircraft at Reno. Sea Furies and heavily modified Bearcats competed seriously, but it was consistently the most numerous, and in the perception of the crowd, the most iconic. The aircraft that had won the air war over Europe was now winning races over the Nevada desert, and the connection between those two achievements was part of what the crowd had come to see. The racing community's relationship with the Mustang was, from the beginning, characterized by a tension between preservation and consumption. Racing modified aircraft, running engines at power settings they were never designed to sustain, flying at airspeeds that tested every rivet and weld, destroyed machines, engines failed, airframes were stressed beyond recovery, some aircraft crashed, and the crashes at Reno were sometimes fatal. The racing Mustang occupied a paradox. It was simultaneously the most intensely used and the most carefully attended to version of the type, maintained by mechanics of extraordinary skill and dedication, and yet it was also the version most likely to be consumed in the pursuit of speed. Against this attrition, the parallel world of warbird preservation was building a different kind of future for the Mustang. The term warbird, applied to vintage military aircraft maintained in flying condition, had not yet entered common usage in the 1950s, but the impulse it describes was already present. Men who had flown military aircraft in the war, or who had grown up watching them, began to acquire surplus examples not for modification or commercial use, but for preservation. The instinct was not primarily historical or museological, at least not initially. It was personal, visceral, rooted in attachment to a machine that had meant something to people who had trusted their lives to it. The economics of warbird preservation transformed over the decades in ways that would have been difficult to predict from the vantage point of the surplus depot in 1946. The Mustang that had sold for hundreds of dollars in the immediate post-war years climbed in value as surviving airworthy examples became fewer, and the cultural memory of the Second World War became more deliberately curated. By the 1970s, a flying P-51 was worth tens of thousands of dollars. By the 1980s, that figure had climbed into 6 digits. By the early 21st century, a fully restored, airworthy P-51D in excellent condition could command prices in excess of $2 million. Some exceptional examples: original combat aircraft with documented histories associated with known pilots or significant missions, sold for considerably more. The transformation from cheap surplus to million-dollar artifact tracked, imperfectly but perceptibly, the arc of American memory about the Second World War. The generation that had fought the war aged into a position of cultural authority in which its experience was recognized as having been historically singular. The aircraft of that war became material objects through which that experience could be approached, honored, mourned. The P-51 was the most legible of those objects, recognizable in silhouette to people who had never seen one fly, associated in the popular imagination with the decisive moment when American industrial power and human skill had together turned the course of history. The preservation community that formed around the warbird movement was, and remains, a community of remarkable dedication. The skills required to maintain a flying Merlin engine, to source parts for a machine whose production line closed decades ago, to understand the metallurgy and the tolerances of an era before computer-aided design, are rare and are being transmitted, with varying success, to younger generations of mechanics and restorers. Every flying P-51 in existence today represents not only the original labor of the men and women who built it, but the ongoing labor of the people who have kept it alive across the intervening decades. Set against the preservation story is the story of what was lost, and what was lost was most of it. Of the more than 15,500 P-51s built, the number that survive in any form is a small fraction. The exact count of airworthy examples fluctuates as aircraft are restored from static display or damaged in accidents, but it is measured in the hundreds, not the thousands. The remaining survivors, in museums, in private collections, in various states of restoration, bring the total of all existing Mustangs in any condition to perhaps 600 or fewer. The arithmetic is sobering. Of every 25 Mustangs that North American built, approximately 24 no longer exist in any recognizable form. The disappearance happened in stages. The first wave was the immediate post-war scrapping, the systematic reduction of surplus aircraft to aluminum ingot, driven by the same industrial logic that had produced them. Smelters in the American Southwest processed aircraft by the hundreds. Some accounts describe the fuselages being bulldozed into piles before cutting, the distinctive outline of the fighter reduced to a geometric abstraction against the desert sky, then gone. There is something in those images, if they were photographed, if the photographs survive, that belongs to the literature of loss rather than the literature of industrial economics, though at the time the participants were thinking about neither. The second wave was slower and more diffuse. Aircraft that had survived the initial post-war surplus disposal were worn out through use, damaged in accidents, or simply allowed to deteriorate in fields and hangars where the cost of restoration eventually exceeded the will or the resources of their owners. The agricultural Mustangs, used as crop dusters and in other commercial applications for which their performance was spectacularly ill-suited, were particularly vulnerable. An aircraft that requires constant, knowledgeable maintenance to remain airworthy will not survive inattention, and inattention is the default condition of machines that have been repurposed for work they were not designed for, by owners who do not share the original designer's reverence for what they have. What survives is, by the measure of what was built, almost nothing, and yet, by any other measure, what survives is remarkable. Somewhere today, on an airfield in California or Texas or Wisconsin or England or Australia, a P-51 is being started. The Merlin fires with the sound that pilots who flew them in combat described for the rest of their lives, a sound that carries within it, for those who know how to listen, the accumulated meaning of everything the machine was and did and represented. The fighter that once flew escort over Berlin now flies for the pleasure of the crowd, for the dedication of its owner, for the continuity of a specific kind of memory that only a flying machine can provide. The Mustang's arc from warrior to warbird is not a simple story of triumph or tragedy. It contains elements of both, along with the mundane, the bureaucratic disposal, the commercial utility, the accidental survival, the gradual recognition that what had been treated as surplus was in fact irreplaceable. The machines that were scrapped because the people who scrapped them were operating within a perfectly rational framework of post-war economics, and nothing in that framework suggested that aluminum ingot was less valuable than historical memory. The machines that survived did so through combinations of luck, personal attachment, financial resources, and the particular stubbornness of the people who refused to let them go. The fighter is now worth more in dollar terms than the country paid to build it. It is maintained by people who were not born when it last flew in combat. It is admired by crowds who know its silhouette from films and photographs and the testimony of grandparents. It occupies a place in the national mythology that no one would have predicted from the vantage point of the surplus depot, where the line of machines waiting for the smelter stretched farther than a man could see in the afternoon light, and the accountants were working through their ledgers, and no one was thinking about what it meant for a great weapon to become, in the fullness of time, a monument to itself. The P-51 Mustang flew in service for the last time under a national flag in the late 1970s when the Dominican Air Force retired its final examples. It had been flying operationally for nearly 4 decades. No other piston-engine fighter of the Second World War served as long in as many conflicts under as many flags. That record belongs to the machine entirely, to the design, to the engineering, to the marriage of American airframe and British engine that produced something neither country could have built alone. The archive has kept it. The medal for those who found it worth keeping has endured. If the Mustang's story ends with preservation and memory rather than with combat and obsolescence, that ending is neither tidy nor complete. There are Mustangs in hangars that will never fly again. There are Mustangs that will crash before this decade is out, consumed by the same forces that consumed those that preceded them. There are records unread in archives, photographs undeveloped in collections, stories untold by men who carried them to their graves. The machine persists in some of its examples, but the totality of what it was, what it meant to the men who flew it and the men who died beneath it, belongs now to the territory of the irrecoverable. But a warrior that found its way into the permanent record of human achievement has been preserved, if imperfectly, and that, in the long arithmetic of history, is more than most machines are granted. If the fate of the P-51 Mustang has stayed with you, there is another American war machine whose story deserves to be told, An aircraft that served the same war, flew the same skies, and disappeared into a silence even deeper. That story is waiting for you on Lost War Machines.